I now leave the floor to Professor Santosh Ibrahim to moderate the panel Beyond the Anthropocene.
Right. And it's really wonderful to be here joining you. So in this panel on ecology, we have three papers. We will, as being introduced to the audience, we will listen first to the speakers, and we can interact with them later. So I invite the first speaker now, Ms. Susan Harris from IIT Delhi, to present the paper. Her paper is very interesting and most discussed domain, the ethnographic exploration of street dogs in Delhi. Ms. Susan, welcome, and you have 15 minutes for the presentation.
Hi everyone, am I audible?
Yes.
Hi, thanks everyone for being here this afternoon. After attending some sessions yesterday and today, I think this is the only panel to address non-human life in what is increasingly becoming mostly human spaces. Therefore, the interest in the environment and especially non-human life, it's intimately connected to the interest in the Anthropocene and the understanding of humankind itself as a kind of geological factor. Animal geographies documenting multi-species cities, they focused on how different environments collide with each other due to expanding development and urbanization. And often animal use of the city has drawn attention to how animals cleverly navigate city spaces or use human infrastructure to surprising ends. My presentation takes the idea of a multi-species world and a multi-species city for granted to define more sharply more than human spatialities. And to do this, I focus on street dogs in Delhi to investigate the relationship between a canine Umwelt and a multi-species city. To introduce briefly the concept Umwelt as proposed by Jakob von Uexküll, which many of you may be familiar with, it literally translates as surrounding world or environment. And the idea of Umwelt, it's a radical theorization of animal life because Uexküll is interested in what it is like to be an animal through understanding the reality of the environment for the animals. So he's not interested in a mechanistic or materialist interpretation of life because to him they're inadequate and incomplete, and because they do not account for the interiority of these living organisms in any way. And one of the really interesting conclusions that he reaches is that each animal constructs its own environment out of its perceptions, actions, and relationships. And he's not the first, of course, to suggest that reality is more than one physical world, but he's one of the first to really push the subjective experience of the animal. And his adoption of this subjective position is such that he rejects the notion that we'll ever get to a reality outside of subjective perceptions. And what this implies is that it addresses this tendency to anthropomorphize nature, that is, to see nature and by extension any kind of spaces, urban spaces, towards ends that only we humans can objectively perceive. And this is challenging when we think about any kind of multi-species spaces, especially urban spaces, because they are synonymous with being human and living human lives. And I also want to point out that the environment of one's own, available to one's own perception, if we were to define Umwelt in human terms, it's more complicated in multi-species worlds because we share so much built environment. So, for instance, there's no easy answer to the question, what phenomenal salience does the city have for the street dog? Because in its unique relationship with humans and human spaces, dogs are simultaneously omnipresent and liminal creatures of the city. And in India, street dogs are recognized legally as ownerless dogs and they can't be killed or dislocated. And in this way, their vagrant hybrid existence, it's validated. And as we know, they're very common in campuses and urban areas. And as free-ranging dogs, they blur the boundaries of companionate species by living on the streets in specific territories and actively negotiating crises of location and place. And these territories are marked out by animal hierarchies and availability of food. And yet, the street dog also gives the appearance of self rule within them. And I really think that a significant aspect of their existence in India is their legal status as street dogs. So they can roam freely, they need not have owners, etc. And it is this legally sanctioned vagrancy that allows this Indian street dog to exercise agency in their relations with humans. So they may enjoy freedom of movement, staying in self-demarcated territories, existing in packs which may or may not comprise family members. Space is then central to their lives in many ways. Of course, with increasing urbanization, street dogs do face loss of land and home, but they also combine and coalesce with the urban landscapes. And this is not to suggest, of course, that they do not face, like other animals or other non-human life, mistreatment and cruelty at the hands of the humans, but that in the Anthropocene, that they're also part of the evolving urban mythologies of modern societies in India. So street dogs are not consigned to an unchanging, invariable tradition of fixed location, such as for wildlife or domestic pets who have to stay inside homes. And while I'm not going to conclude definitively, especially considering the state-sanctioned biopolitical control of their bodies, I'm proposing that this vagrancy and its legal sanction does allow the continued existence of the street dog umwelt in the Anthropocene. In the rest of the paper, I will consider this concept of the umwelt quickly along three axes of visibility, physicality, and interdependence. And one of the first aspects is visibility. The criterion of visibility, it's crucial to recognize any kind of multi-species possibility in the Anthropocene. We can only acknowledge or have an ethical relation with what we can see or there is a possibility of seeing. So by granting every animal an umwelten, what Booskul does is also to make visible those animal beings as those that independently exist. And this is an important distinction, I think, because when we're talking about urban nature, all non-human life kind of gets conflated in this non-human, what's not human category, or there is this narrative of how non-human life is dependent on humans, and we have this ethical imperative to coexist or realize that humans are causing a lot of damage. And in India, street dogs, as we know, are highly visible fixtures of the city, imprinting on the architectural expanse of the urban space, who are in some ways dependent on humans, but are also relatively self-contained. This and we know that this visibility, it becomes even more striking when they are injured or require medical help. So in some ways, this visibility is also a visibility as marginality. And this visibility as marginality, it's not just because of an ethical lack or moral deficiency on the part of the human. And I think that what I'm trying to suggest is that the response or the relationship with the street dog it's thus never complete or definite and is often highly context dependent. So for this reason, strategies for caring for the street dog in India vary widely. So while the street dog is not allowed to be relocated, there is a concerted effort among NGOs to promote the adoption of street dogs over purebred dogs. And the other thing is that because they are immediately recognizable as street dogs, sometimes because of the easily recognizable pedigree, which confers on it another layer of visibility. And there is also this association of adaptability with the Indian street dog, which is closely connected to indigeneity. So in urban spaces, they are out of place, but there is this understanding also that they are indigenous to local spaces and therefore are associated with locality, with nature, and so on. What I'm trying to show is that the canine umwelt in the multi-species city is translated into visibility for humans in a number of ways despite their animal presence. And what this means is that thinking about non-human life, it's not simply a question of right to place, which is a major concern among theorists like Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka, but it is also about how the subjective perception of the space is interpreted subjectively by humans, or in other words, how the canine umwelt is interpreted by humans. The second aspect that Umwelt alerts us to is whether space is purely a physical dimension for humans and non-human alikes. And this is not to sidestep discussions of whether non-humans can access subjectively physical spaces at all, but the question is important because when we're thinking about accounting for urban nature in cities, because there's always this conversation about how we have to share the space, the city space, with non-human life. And I'm not saying that this vocabulary is inaccurate because we do have to share space, but thinking about it this way also means that we have to choose and prioritize, and that usually includes a conflict between humans and non-humans. And here I just briefly want to gesture towards this increased emphasis on narrative and place in fields like multi-species ethnography that shows us how the narratives of non-humans, such as animals, should matter. And this what they call it is this non-human storying of places. And what this means is that it makes animals constitutive of existence in the Anthropocene by figuring alternative ways of individuating and embodying that is not restricted to the human. Or if we were to draw a corollary, then the storying of places it's very similar to the conceptualization of Umwelt. The question raised by the storying of places, or thinking that every animal subject has a story associated with a particular space, is if we are cohabitating a space with an animal, how can we make them narratival subjects contra humans without making their use of urban spaces look artificial or unnatural? The third aspect to consider is how the concept of umwelt addresses questions of interdependence, which has become so primary in the Anthropocene. So Ugskul's view of nature as that of this all-embracing, interweaving, connects all forms of life, even as he emphasizes the indivisibility of animal umwelten. And this is also an important concern in the Anthropocene because this heightened focus on interdependence, interconnections, what this means is that agency seems to reside only in flows and networks, eliminating the essential living things that live with us in a cityscape. And what I want to suggest to these three aspects, one of the keys to thinking about the problem, I suggest, lies in the in waste. The relationship between street dogs and garbage is well documented. And this necessarily means that street dogs are more visible in urban areas near places of disposal of public waste. And indeed, street dogs are not just visible only near garbage dumps and landfill sites, but also frequently at hotels, restaurants, shopping centers, and homes where they're given food that is left over or in excess. And waste plays a crucial role in the urban economy and probably the Indian economy. And urban ordering, apart from being a witness and remainder to development and industrialization. So waste is, it could be defined as what is determined as expendable by citizens and the state. And of course, it's also increasingly associated with a clean, urban, green future. And there are also innumerable informal economies of poor people, children, and animals that engage with waste. And the superior knowledge of waste pickers and rag pickers of waste through their collection, sorting, and salvage procedures, they've also been noted in urban studies. And street dogs also possess a similar repertoire of expertise relating to garbage. So, thus, while street dogs may very well have alternative non human worldviews that can alert us to other ontologies, they're also already workers in a multi species workplace and are co constitutive of urban ecologies through their participation.
Ms. Susan,
So,
you have 2 more minutes to complete.
yes, I'm just wrapping up. So what I'm proposing is that the contingency of the Anthropocene is such that it invites us to undercut human exceptionalism by not only recognizing non-human ways of inhabiting infinite phenomenal worlds such as the canine Umwelt, but also by actively registering and foregrounding the permanent precariousness of the relationships forged between species, such as between the street dog and the human. So the concept of Umwelt, it's not relevant just to show the animal perspective or the animal point of view, but also to understand how how space becomes such a contentious point when it is shared or used by members of completely different species. And what I've tried to show in the paper is that an examination of Umwelt as a subjective universe, which is one of the phrases that School uses to define Umwelt, uh, is that an examination of the Umwelt of the animal reconfigures space that humans and non-humans share in cities into projects of intersections and overlaps of experiencing and interpreting that space, as the question of waste clearly shows us. What I want to suggest then is that when we think about multi-species spaces in the backdrop of the philosophical ramifications of the Anthropocene, that we move beyond anthropocentric conceptions of space as physical space, especially when it comes to non-humans, as spaces that are being shared, or just spaces as spaces that can be rationed and allocated. Thanks.
Right. Thank you, Ms. Susan, for the presentation, and it was really interesting, and you have very sharply presented your arguments and analysis, especially on the visibility and marginality while examining the case of street dogs in Delhi. We will discuss your paper after the other 2 presentations. Now I invite Ms. Survi Naik and Mijo Luke for their presentation on changing spatiality and emergence of environmental politics. You have another 15 minutes.
To your connection will be asking of my this is
Surabhi, there
actually
is
a
some.
collaborative.
Please carry on. Please carry on.
Okay.
There was some
Yes.
connection problem. Now it seems okay.
Video. Yeah. So this paper is a collaborative work between me and my colleague at Center for Development Studies, and we both have carried out ethnographic field work in two of the environmentally sensitive regions in India. So one focuses on a coal mining area and another focuses on the sensitive area, highlands of Kerala, basically. And here we basically try to look at the changing speciality in both of these two ecologically sensitive areas through looking at the changing materiality of land and what implications it has on the environmental politics in these two regions. So I don't have slides to present here, so I'll be mostly reading out from my paper. So as we know, various conflicts and struggle over the access and control of resources constitute the core of environmental politics in the global south. The changing contours of speciality in the rural areas play an important role in understanding the emergence of such environmental politics from the diverse regions. At the same time, land has a multi-dimensional presence and holds multifaceted meanings in the lives of the agrarian communities, as argued by Nikita Sood. Moreover, giving a renewed attention to land enables us to understand its changing uses and values in rural areas. Unsurprisingly, land also plays a crucial role in shaping the changing speciality in agrarian societies, particularly with the historical exclusion of marginalized communities from the land. There have been many attempts to understand how land is constituted as a resource. In this context, the paper demonstrates the changing speciality of environmentally sensitive regions through tracing the changing materiality of land and its implications for environmental challenges in the global south. The paper borrows and employs the assemblage thinking to understand the changing materiality of land from these diverse regions of India. In doing so, we understand land as an assemblage of materialities and community relations which aligned together to form the speciality of regions. Understanding assemblage of land involve relevant actors in the forms of various communities. Adopting an analytical assemblage of land helps us to understand the speciality. For instance, many have argued that a resource is assemblage of heterogeneous elements and a critical reflection should expose these elements. Therefore, one case, as I have already mentioned, focuses on the coal mining region located in the state of Orissa, and the other case focuses on the ecologically sensitive area of highlands of Kerala. The paper argues that the materiality of land is assembled with social relations, which created exclusion of marginalized community in both the cases. The historical exclusion, here I emphasize the historical exclusion coupled with the changing land uses and diverse livelihood strategies of dominant communities reproduces the inequalities, and the paper argues that these inequalities make the core of the speciality of these regions, the two environmentally sensitive regions that we have looked at, and have specific implications for environmental politics in each of these cases. So this paper, firstly, we try to examine the intertwining relationship between land ownership, land use, and socio-economic relations existing. Then secondly, we looked at the changing materiality of land, which has changed from being a productive resource to speculative asset through changing land use practices in both of the cases. And thirdly, we have tried to look at and analyze the reproduction of inequality and changing livelihood strategies adopted by both the dominant and marginalized community in the process of changing speciality in each case. And we have tried to offer some concluding observations reflecting upon the implications of changing speciality and spatial practices of the communities on environmental politics in two of these diverse cases of environmentally sensitive areas. So to briefly introduce you to the two areas. So one area that I have talked about is the coal mining area, which is in the state of Orissa, and the area is known as Talcher coalfields, and it is one of the coalfields which is being operated by the Coal India Limited, a public sector company. And the Talcher coalfields has been developing a fastest growing industrial centers of India. Presently, it has 8 open cast and 1 underground mine, and 2 open cast minings are in planning stage. Historically, Talcher has been an agrarian society. Agriculture was the important activity of the area, and Talcher has been comprising of mixed population, mixed caste settlement. Basically, it has around 19% of Dalits, 9% of Adivasis, and dominated by other upper caste and other backward classes communities in this area. So basically, the land has been acquired by the public sector company using the Coal Bearing Areas Act of 1957 and Land Acquisition Act of 1894. And since then, coal mining has been taking place in this particular area. Secondly, to introduce the second site, as we know, like Kerala is on the Kerala is on the southwestern fringes of the Western Ghats. Kerala is distinguished with a wide range of agroecological conditions, which is dominated by undulating hills, and it has 3 major physiographic regions known as lowland, midland, and highland regions. And Kerala's geographical location is unique, and it is already prone to climate vulnerabilities, particularly floods and landslides. And we also know that around 4.5 crore people are dependent on the Western Ghats for their livelihood across the state of Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Goa, Maharashtra, and Gujarat. So in Kerala, basically after the promotion of migration through Grow More Food program by the state, people from the Midlands started to venture into the high ranges of Idukki. And Tankamani is the village which is chosen in this particular case, where we see that Tankamani is located in the southern part of the Idukki district in Western Ghats, and it is newly formed Idukki Taluk, which has witnessed the wave of Syrian Christian migration to the high ranges. And Tankamani area falls under the 123 ecologically sensitive area villages classified as in by the Kasturi Rangan report. Consequently, Tankamani has also become one of the settlements that formed agitation against Western Ghats Ecology Expert Panel report under the Catholic Church ages. So, so basically what we try to see here is we try to look at the social relations constituting in these 2 sites. And in these 2 particular regions, what we saw is a very unique, intricate relation between the dominant communities and the land. Basically, the dominant communities were were the ones who were owning the good quality land, and they were the ones who were actually possessing most quantity of the lands. As we also see in Talcher, that the dominant higher upper caste and other backward classes were owning the most of the good and cultivable land, whereas the Dalits of the areas were the most landless, and they were working as the agricultural laborers. And basically, the paddy cultivation was the main mode of cultivation agricultural practice which was conducted in those areas. And in Tankamani as well, as we see that there was different waves of migration to the area, and there was there was the discourse of encroachment, which the encroachment also witnessed conflicts between groups of encroachers over the possession of the quality of land. As a result, the encroachers who are less influential in money and other resources had to be satisfied with the low quality land. The latter category included the landless laborers who played an integral part in the encroachment both from the Syrian Christian community and Dalit community. The landless were given less fertile land with rocks which constitute ecologically sensitive areas. And as a result, Dalit families started staying together or at a different part of the settlement, altogether ecologically sensitive area. However, the idea of who came first influenced the power in local discourses of Tankamani. And as a consequence, we see that power in the social relations underlies in the formation of Tankamani and depends on where the community are settled. For example, Syrian Christian families started getting concentrated near the city and church, whereas we see that Dalits are mostly on the ecologically sensitive parts of the area. So what we see here is that in the case of Tankamani, the migration process has created a sharp inequality between the communities, and the inequality was carried forward to settling communities regarding access to resources, quality of land, and formed relational inequalities. So this social relations, how this social relation shapes the land use practices that we see in these two cases. So first, in the Talcher coal mines that we see, because of the coal mines, now the land use practices has diverted from the agricultural practices to the coal mining in the region. So as we see here, that in 1973, the coal mines area was 2.6 square kilometer, which increased to 11.38 square kilometer. And similarly, in 2009, the coal mining operations had already increased to 34 square kilometers. So basically, it is the coal mining and also the increase in built-up area that we see in Talcher coalfields, and also in the Tankamani area, we see there is a pattern of mixed crop cultivation, and migration has undoubtedly contributed to land use and vegetation changes. There were various waves of mixed crop cultivation carried out in this area. And by 1980s, the land was converted to agricultural land except for some exposed rock. The revegetation of the land occurred mostly through cultivating every portion of the land. Tapioca was grown in all homestead lands. Paper is generally as a mixed crop. This crop was also attempted to be cultivated in this area. Consequently, Tankamani emerged as a primary center of paper cultivation in the area. And at present, what that because of the different waves of mixed crop cultivation pattern, we see that the land classification is primarily like built up areas, mainly expanding townships and residential areas, and more towards commercial cultivation of mixed crops such as cardamom, tea, pepper, coffee. And both the built up areas and also the increasing commercial cultivation in this area is shaped by the dominant communities, primarily the Syrian Christians. So what we observed in both the cases is that there is a changing speciality. So earlier, the land which was regarded as a productive resource for agricultural purposes has now turned into a speculative asset. In Talcher, what we see is that because of the land acquisition for coal mining, we see that the agricultural land has turned into a speculative asset for accessing better compensation for employment in the coal mines. So basically, the landowners who are basically from the dominant communities of other backward classes and upper castes, they have been able to access formal and also informal occupations in the coal mines in exchange of land. So there has been a growing discourse of livelihoods in exchange of this land. So in many instances, there has been purchase of land in nearby villages by the displaced and dispossessed communities to access more and more of occupations in the coal mines. So money as well is that post 1990s, with educational mobility, we see a pattern of transnational migration from the dominant communities as they see that agriculture is no more viable. And this increasing connections, and in this increasing transnational connections and multiple income sources for landowning community, leaves us with question of who is a real farmer now. Because according to the survey, 40% of the third generation of Syrian Christians are finding jobs abroad. So in this case of Tankamani also, we see that land is no more seen as a productive asset. On the other hand, the marginalized communities are finding casual jobs and vulnerable to ecological risk because of the historical deprivation. In the light of the dooming scenario in agriculture, only those who have alternate income sources or remittances can sustain. So where the changing materialities of land in both of the cases leaves us, and where how do we see the environmental discourses in these two environmentally sensitive areas? So in Talcher, Talcher is one of the most critically polluted regions of India at present. As we know, because of the coal mining, there have been critical air pollution to water pollution, and the communities are at the margins. However, the dominant communities that we see here, we see that despite of acute environmental fragility, the mobilization and collective actions are mostly around the demands of work by the dominant communities, and the dominant communities have also been able to cope up with the environmental crisis with better remunerative jobs. On the other hand, the land use in the last 60 years has put the ecology in danger at Tankamani. Moreover, there is no much deliberation about the report or its recommendation in Thankamani even after 7 years of the Western Ghats ecology expert report being released. For instance, farmers are skeptical that how are they projected in the eviction threats. The support of the church during the migration process and eviction drives makes them diluted by the church narratives. Nevertheless, the marginal communities respondents have expressed concerns on the discourses as they are not addressing the land question. This is because the marginalized communities are vulnerable to ecological risk and foresee the danger. So we see that in this case also, like the Syrian Christian community with profound transnational connections have like organized the agitation against the Western Ghats ecology expert report rather than contributing to the conservation efforts in this particular case. So what I want to conclude here by using this two case study uh, is that the materiality of land has changed from being productive asset ways that we have seen, and one is on the account of state coercion mechanism for coal mining, and another through the dominant community-driven transnational migration. As we saw, the pre-existing inequalities in terms of land ownership is reproduced in the process of changing specialities in both the cases, and the dominant caste communities in both the cases have adopted better livelihood strategies by resorting to remittances and commercial cultivation in Kerala, whereas remunerative formal and informal occupations in coal mines of Orissa. In contrast, marginalized Dalit communities who are historically deprived from land ownership are found to be engaged in precarious livelihoods ranging from casual labor to coal scavenging in respective cases. So in these two empirical cases, we demonstrated that different tactics employed by the communities to mitigate environmental crisis in the face of changing speciality, where these tactics get entangled, shaping the environmental politics of the regions. And to just finally my presentation, even though the environmental crisis has taken toll on the different communities, it is the dominant caste communities who have shaped the discourses differently. As we saw in the case of Talches, the discourses around the discourse of demanding more work rather than on the environmental conservation efforts. And on the other hand, what we see in Thankamani as well, the Syrian Christian communities have in fact carried out agitations against the conservation report rather than contributing to it. And we need to also question, like, where does this kind of dynamics, these discourses, leaves the marginalized communities who are at the margins. So here I conclude. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Surbi, for your presentation. You have nicely examined the local context of environmental politics with two very important case studies. We will discuss your paper after the next presentation. Now, we have a last paper on history, particularly pre-colonial Mughal history, and I invite Jonmani Das for the presentation.
Hello. Actually, I wanted to present a PPT as well. So, yeah, thank you. This paper is a part of my broader MPhil dissertation, wherein I had looked into aspects of environment, territoriality, and the power relations that were generated amongst various polities of the 16th and 17th century Brahmaputra Valley. However, in this paper specifically, I am looking into how, on one hand, the environment of the Brahmaputra Valley placed limitations on the Mughal estate's effort to articulate its territoriality, and on the other, how the Mughals tried to adapt and negotiate with the given conditions to tie together disparate points into a coherent territorial space. In the Brahmaputra Valley, the Mughals had to encounter three sovereign states, the Kuch Bihar state, the Kamrup state, and as well as the Ahoms. And there were, in addition to these, several small chieftaincies which were diplomatically tied to either of the three bigger polities. Again, in the Brahmaputra Valley, the Mughals were present with a very peculiar environment, one that was unfamiliar and unpleasant to them. The landscape was marked by abundant water bodies, overwhelming cover of forests, scattered hills, and a prolonged monsoon season, which often resulted in recurrent floods. So, despite the repeated attempts of the Mughals to secure control over the region, environmental factors severely curtailed their ambitions. So, in this paper, what I attempt to do is any attempt of to write spatial history of this area must consider questions of how the given physical environment was negotiated with and accounted for in the state's effort to spatially organize its presence. I try to illustrate that the given environmental context of the valley curtailed mobility and constricted the state's ability to maintain unbroken control. Territorial presence of the state remains in such conditions remains dispersed and was marked by controlling specific points rather than having unbroken boundaries and contiguous areas. So territoriality was contingent on the state's capacity to facilitate movement of the state machinery, which was its army and officials across the geographical space it aspired to control. Therefore, this paper basically tries to explore a range of strategies that the Mughals had to incorporate in order to optimize their capacity to facilitate effective movement. Um, so I'll start with the first slide. So one, as mentioned before, the one of the foremost concerns of the state of manpower to be made functional. So as we can see, the accounts repeatedly refer to the strain that was placed on the Mughals in the process of discovering and clearing routes through the heavily forested plains and hills. So the primary strategy was to use boatmen who were usually were usually employed from the nearby villages to clear the path. So before an army would march ahead, the boatmen would be sent and they would clear the jungles. However, at times the routes were entirely absent, and therefore such difficult stretches had to be cleared with the help of elephants. So one of the processes is mentioned in the third reference in one of the primary sources. So again, I forgot to mention the primary sources for this period basically are two first-hand accounts of Mughal officials serving in this region. One is Bahar Sane Gaibi from the early part of the 17th century, and one is Shihabuddin Talis is Tariq-e-Asham from the second part of the 17th century. Now, given that the landscape was crisscrossed by several rivers and rivulets, the land army required the naval fleet to assist the India movement. The land army had to cross several rivers on their march. Now, unaided crossing was possible when the army could locate a shallow part of a river. However, it was difficult to cross the bigger rivers such as the Brahmaputra without the help of the fleet. However, it was not only the land army that required help. So, as we can see on one occasion, the Mughal commander who was sent towards the home territories he had traveled with his fleet without waiting for the army to arrive, and therefore, upon reaching a narrow part of the river, because he did not have the assistance of the land army, the rebels of Kamrup came from either side and wounded a large number of his followers. So, what we can see is a mutual cooperation between a fleet and army was essential, and the lack of the same could delay movement or even make the army and the fleet vulnerable. And a very interesting tactic here for crossing rivers was the use of boats. So now boats would be joined together. Several boats would be usually joined together, and then they would be used to transport men and animals. Now, how crossing rivers and traversing through hill passes and forested routes was only a part of the process. What was more important for an expeditionary army as well as for administrative management of the area was to maintain in stable communication and supply lines. And we can see that the standard practice for an army on the march or after an army had gained control over a place was to secure hold by establishing a thana and placing it under the charge of an official. So thanas essentially were the points through which Mughals sought to assert control over the surrounding areas. They also ensured safe passage for the reinforcement or subsequent movement of the army and the ration. So again, it was important to build a mechanism which was guarantee unhindered flow of rations for the army on the march. And usually we can see that when the army would march, they would leave a detachment behind as an intermediary guide to supply ration from the main fort to the detachment which has moved ahead. Now, supply lines also had to be connected to the fleet. So the Thana would be further inland, and it would be connected to the fleet, which would be stationed on a major river's course, river bank, and by a string of forts in between. Uh, Now, actually, what we see is construction of forts was another critical aspect of controlling a territory. It was used both for defensive and offensive purposes. It enabled them to enclose an area, and we see that there was usually a main forts and several other redoubts around it. And as the landscape was interspersed with dense forest, it was important to clear out jungles around the fort to avoid possibilities of a surprise attack, as well as to create space for mounting a cavalry charge if and when required. So there are several instances wherein we find that there are when we find references to untoward consequences which can arise due to inability of the forces to quickly construct a force. For instance, as we can see, a particular official failed to complete before it grew dark, and as a consequence had no place to fall back upon, and was his entire army was decimated. uh, um, Forts, now the important part is the selection of forts, sites for the forts. These sites were the sites for these forts usually would be strategic in the sense they would control the passage of movement of the army, of the rations, and it would be at the banks of a river or at confluence of two rivers or at important hill passes. In the first reference, as you can see, we see that the fort of Rangamati, which was the western edge of the Brahmaputra Valley, was rather important for ingress and egress of people from Bengal, and therefore it repeatedly came out to protect other locations crucial for uninterrupted movement, such as a narrow and fordable stretch of a river, bridges. Additionally, other basic necessities such as water sources for the camp followers had to be also be defended by constructing forts. Now, and very a characteristic feature of the Brahmaputra Valley is that of its intense rainfall. So, in one of the accounts, Sihabuddin Thales refers that it rains continuously for 8 long months, and it also rains occasionally during the winter months. Heavy rains caused rivers and other water bodies to overflow, and it resulted in a set of inescapable difficulties. Flooding meant that the land routes were mostly submerged, making it difficult for men and horses to move. And given that Mughals primarily relied on a cavalry to a great extent, it could impose serious limitations on their military potential. Also, as you can see, crossing and navigating overflowing rivers were hazardous, and it further restricted mobility across rivers. So again, rains again could come into the process of constructing forts and stockades, which was crucial for the purpose of defense. So in one occasion, Mirza Nathan was the official. He mentions that a part of the stockade which was raised came down, and all attempts to preserve it went for nothing. And on another occasion, the construction of the fort itself had to be delayed because of waterlogging. So during the monsoons, maintaining links between thanas became a grueling task. Sihabuddin Talis's account gives us a very detailed picture of the disruption that were caused after the monsoons began in 1662. The entire area was flooded, and because the fleet was stationed far behind, and all the supply lines were threatened, the intermediate thanas then became isolated from each other, and despite repeated attempts to uh, link them, it failed because of the absence of boats, and also because the land routes has completely disappeared. At the same time, existing forts could be washed away, especially those on the banks of rivers, and it became a necessary part of Mughal presence that they had to seasonally retreat and evacuate some of their forts. And the obvious consequence of this was that this would disrupt the supply of food and other communication lines. Uh, Even the process of transporting grain suffered as a result, due to the insufficient means of transport, or because of the damage that was caused due to delays in transportation. Uh, now what important tactic which is recurrent in the accounts is that of artificial flooding. And like in addition to natural flooding, there was an added danger of artificial floods. We have quite a few reference, like what we can see on the screen here, that when areas were deliberately flooded either by cutting banks of rivers or linking it with smaller water bodies together, and that way the entire fort or the routes could be submerged and making it difficult for the army to move or remain stationed at a particular place. But it would be incorrect that it to assume that such acts of deliberate flooding always worked against the interests of the Mughals. In fact, the Mughals at times deliberately use their same tactic to operate their fleet in places where the other modes of mobility were restricted. For instance, on a particular march, Mirza Nathan again, he found that the route had become muddy, making it difficult for his land army to advance. So he sent his men and animals back to Pandu, which was on the banks of Brahmaputra, and made them cut open the banks of Brahmaputra so that plains and jungles in the surrounding areas might be overflooded, and then enabled him to bring his fleet and proceed onwards towards his march to that fort. Now, this is the last slide basically. Well, honor our aspects of the environment would be lacking if we do not incorporate animals in the narrative. As we have already referred to, they perform certain important logistical and military tasks which are otherwise not possible, such as clearing the forested routes, transporting rations in difficult terrains, as well as in siege warfare. However, the demanding setting of the Brahmaputra Valley also impacted the capacity of animals in discharging the task, as they affected those that of humans. So this reveals how the biological limits and possibilities of animals influence Mughal affairs in the Brahmaputra Valley. So in addition to several other factors which we have already looked into, the distance and pace at which an army could march also depended on the extent and horses and elephants could move without exhausting themselves. Again, during the movement of rations, as we find that rains and floods made it difficult for bullock carts to move. Again, continuous marching could at times result in lack of grazing time, and which then further limited the fodder that was available for animals, which meant that they had to make forced halts. So finally, I would try and conclude this by saying that that the Mughal affairs in the Brahmaputra Valley had to placed by the environment. So what we see is that effective territorial control depended on the manner in which terrain, geography, topography, and river courses were utilized and negotiated with for maintaining contact and communication across various sites. Authority and control in the valley, and therefore territoriality,
Hello, I think Germany has lost connection. Please stay on.
Hello, John Mini, can you hear us?
I think he might have lost the connection. I think he was also concluding. Shall we proceed then, and we will get back to Germany when he is again online? that fine? Hello?
Hello, so let's just wait for a couple of seconds and then we can
Sure.
proceed.
Okay. Uh, Sorry, I must have lost connection in between. So I don't know at what point I lost my connection. So if someone could just
Mr. John Money, you can make a concluding remark.
okay.
Conclude your paper.
Yeah, thank you. So, as a concluding remark, I would like to say that the given environmental constraints, conditions of the valley placed serious limitations on the effective reach of the Mughal state, and therefore the territory of the Mughals remained dispersed and and their territorial control hold over the geography remained precarious. So this I have not covered in my paper, but however I'd like to state, because this was a part of my MPhil dissertation, that this resulted in generating certain specific forms of power relations, wherein in the wherein officials of individual thanas or the Mughal detachment that were sent had greater autonomy of functioning, and this resulted in the fact that the centralized control of the Mughal state was rather weak and was rather weak. And then that's it. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, right. Very well. Thank you, Mr. John Money, and Ms. Susan, and Ms. Survi for your presentations. All three of you have presented your argument very nicely and very interesting to uh, see also. So, from what I have understood, the papers largely revolved around the major common themes like marginalization, subaltern, and the papers have successfully located these topics with a very specific reference to. So I would now make few observations on each papers, followed by a minor question, and the audience can engage with. The first paper, I'm not. The first two papers, I'm not a expert on topics, but the first paper by Ms. Susan on multi-species configurations in the city has very beautifully traced the shared spaces of humans and non-humans in the city. The city on, or the study largely focused on ethnographic exploration of street dogs and has very beautifully examined the context of companionship in a multi-species world. This was some sort of a very relief to the ongoing discussions on human spaces largely. And as you are aware, while we understand the city and urban spaces, we largely heard from the scholars uh, who have built upon subaltern urbanism, which recognize the agencies of the marginalized and non-elite populations in the city largely. So, in a similar way, I have also some studies have come subaltern animism, where non-human agency, powerlessness could be located. So my first concern to you is, in your study, do you also see such chances of exploration, especially in the context of subaltern animism within the city, as a way of acknowledging animal spaces in the city? You can respond to this kind of question, and I will comment on other papers after your preliminary answer. Ms. Susan, you are here.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for your question, and it's very interesting. I've read a paper exactly on the topic that you've mentioned. In fact, Yamini Narayanan, who also works on Indian animals and also on how they are ideologically configured, she's written a paper on this intersection between coloniality and informality. And she suggests that non-human spaces can be understood as state of exception spaces, borrowing from Agamben. And she suggests this, you called it, I think, subaltern animism. I think she calls it subaltern urbanism. So, which is, it's such a coincidence. And she suggests that the concept subaltern and the potential that it holds through not just marginality, but also how it configures what is not human as the other, as what is killable, and what can be excluded from a particular space. How those become very relevant themes when we think about how things are arranged in urban spaces. And urban spaces, as we know, it's all about arrangement and arrangement in a particular order, especially in states like India, where there is such a focus on development. But thanks for your question.
Right. Very nice. And later you can interact with the other audience also. Now let me put a brief comment on the second paper. The second paper on changing spatiality and the emergence of environmental politics by Ms. Ruby and Luke. They have very beautifully examined these case studies. One is based on Orissa and the other one based on Thangamani in Kerala. Pardon me, I'm not very expert in this area, but as we know, we are living in a time where we see changes in the land pattern due to a variety of factors. So one of the factors which affects the land changes is largely migration and inflow of foreign remittances to the country, which actually significantly altered the agriculture pattern in various regions. So Kerala is also not an exception for that, because Kerala was also witnessing large-scale migration and foreign remittances to this area. So we see that particularly in the agriculture sector, the use of land has changed from, as the paper argued, from a productive resource to more of a speculative asset. So this paper has, in that way, has very successfully discussed how such spatial changes has led to the change in livelihood strategies and also some sort of tensions among the dominant and marginalized communities. While the paper has demonstrated the plight of the affected communities, have you discussed certain ways to tackle such issues legally by using environment, government mechanisms, etc.? How, as a researcher who knew more about these lands, could generate some policy recommendations or suggestions in these two cases? Have you done such kind of analysis also in the paper? That is my brief question. You can respond to this, and we can later go to the other questions. Survi, you are there.
Thank you so much for this question. In fact, I would say that it's a very brilliant question in a sense. Like, we have been, both of us, Mijo and me, have been wondering about this, looking at the unique ways the materiality of land has actually led to the kind of discourses around environmental politics that we see in these two regions. And one of the things like what has struck us is the importance of local democracy that we can say. In the case of Kerala in Thankamani also we can see that like I think like through local democracy in the local democratic institution where we can incorporate the communities say in the environmental governance. I think that would be one very good way to tackle such environmental crisis, and also the kind of like discourses going around in these regions. And also, as I see in the state of Orissa as well, I see there is a lot of scope of the local democratic institutions to play in these scenarios, as we saw that the marginalized communities are all together like pushed to margins in these discourses. The discourses are mostly dominated by the dominant communities towards the livelihoods, who have in some sense also the kind of like mechanisms to cope up with the environmental crisis. So in this case, also I would suggest and also think of something more of the local democratic institutions who can also engage with the kind of environmental crisis both of the cases are facing, and also engage with the marginalized communities and the kind of vulnerabilities that the marginalized communities are facing, and how we can kind of bring a sort of like balance between what we say as a human non-human agency, the human non-human space, as we see very beautifully in these two cases.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I would quickly comment on the last paper, the third paper. Mr. John Money, you are there, I hope.
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
So the third paper is on history, on the making of state spaces in the Mughal period. Money, very decently portrayed how environmental factors played a role in the Mughal state decisions. So we know that it was in the colonial period that surveying, mapping, etc., attained much significance, especially in connection with new governance practices, strategies, etc. I would say that since 1757, the way colonial state has, initiated several types of investigative modalities in India.
Sorry, sir. I couldn't follow you. Your voice is
Uh,
breaking. I'm really sorry. The voice is actually breaking. Is it
are you
probably
able
my
to hear
internet
now?
connection?
Are you
Yes,
able
sir.
to hear me?
Yes,
Okay,
sir.
please. Right. So we know that in the colonial period, it is in the city since the colonial period, largely the mapping and surveying etc. attained more significance, uh, especially in connection with governance practices since 1757 onwards. So your paper has highlighted how similar practices were existed in the pre-colonial period under the Mughals particularly. So can you say a few more or elaborate upon how in a lesser mobility Mughal controlled areas within a larger decentralized governance practices under the Mughals, how were they able to consolidate such environmental concerns? For example, like how in a very remote locality in the state, uh, how Mughals were able to move the practices and strategies. Maybe I was thinking this may take us to look more closely into the context of governance practices like how official communication and information might have shared and extracted or communicated from one agency, one layer to another layer, especially in the context of selection of forts, strategic sites. You have mentioned that Mughals were in fact selecting certain places for the construction of forts, and they were selecting strategic sites, etc. And also, for example, regarding environmental changes and natural calamities, etc. In fact, uh, you know, uh, Bailey has written something on how communication functioned during the colonial period, early colonial period. So, do you see how can you also or have you thought of some sort of aspects with regard to how communication of environmental issues with regard to environmental issues might have how did the Mughal state communicate news about certain changes, certain selection of forts, strategic sites, etc., from one area to another area? I would largely present it as how courier system functions. Uh, it is not only related to environment, but largely in other context. If you have thought about that, you can quickly mention.
Yes, sir. Actually, communication links itself were themselves were very precarious in the region. So there are repeated references in the accounts and the two accounts that we have, which talk about there is a complete breakdown of communication during the monsoons. So that way, but during the other seasons, communication links were usually maintained by making use of local people. So local guides were usually so once the army had marched ahead into a forested area, they would use the local guides is both to guide them through the routes, but and also to send in communications to their main fort. From there on, the communication lines would be established with that of Bengal. So, however, it took a really long time. So, a particular message from Bengal, which was sent out in the month of January, would probably only reach the western part of Brahmaputra Valley by the end of November. So that way, it was really easy to manipulate the information that was coming in. So, and we repeatedly see instances wherein officials of the Mughal officials themselves tried to manipulate the information that was coming in. They would to forge farmans, they would forge parwanas, and in order to exert greater local control over the area domains.
So you have seen some of the sources with regard to this, I hope.
Yes, sir.
Very nice. Yeah. So now my immediate comments are over. And now I think there would be few queries from the other audience also. Please go on.
Yeah, you can now unmute and speak.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, so my first question is to Ms. Suzanne. Thank you for the presentation firstly. I would just like to say that I, as an economic anthropologist, I have a reservation with the term at the Anthropocene, because how Dipesh Chakraborty looks at it, uh, basically kind of leads to a conclusion that it is basically the human beings looking at the nature and kind of reinforcing the nature culture binary. But from that perspective, if you were talking about agency and subaltern assertion or potency of that sort, don't you think that and invoking categories as legality to explain them? What about dogs which do not fit into the streets? For example, in Kolkata, I have seen many street dogs who are categorized as insane or mad dogs, and they are removed from the streets and isolated and even killed and murdered. So they don't have an agency really. On the other hand, what happens is that they are falling prey to the hands of humans, and how we as humans define dogs, define nature, and at the end of the day end up kind of reinforcing the nature culture binary. My second question is to Ms. Surabhi Naik, and I would just like to have a brief comment on how do you understand land as a category in relation to the local class relations in Kerala, because Kerala is a state where land reforms happened, which was fundamentally different from Bengal, and Tennessee was abolition, land ownership was given. George Rees and Amartya Sen has worked on that. And also in Orissa, this can be looked from a framework of Anna Lowenov Zink's kind of characterization of fiction where global and local forces intersect to generate new knowledge. So how do you categorically understand land through these micro studies? And thirdly, I would just like to ask Mr. Janmani about comparative understanding of the Bengal Subha during the Mughal period, because we see that the Mughals developed the exclusive tax system and the embankments were built, and there has been a tremendous amount of historical documentation around this, and archives are available, and which kind of funded the industrial revolution in England. Why don't you think that such a kind of thing happened in Assam? Because both are deltaic regions and both can be comparable to an extent since they are cut by rivulets and a hybrid landscape. So these are the three questions that I particularly had for the three speakers. Thank you.
Please make a short reply. We are running out of time. Please.
Okay, yes, I think I will begin by responding to your questions. They're very interesting questions. And while I don't agree with your reading of Dipesh Chakravarti's controversial and very famous essay on the Anthropocene, the 4 theses on climate history and so on, because from what I remember, the first thesis itself is that anthropogenic explanations of climate change, they kind of collapse this kind of humanist distinction between human history and a natural history. So what Chakravarti is saying, that instead of having human history, which is replete with events of importance of such as wars or industrial development, and having natural history, which is usually matters of taxonomy or figuring out new species and so on, or finding out that a species has become extinct. The Anthropocene kind of inaugurates this merging of both, because humanity is no longer acting at a particular point of importance, but it's become a geological factor. And Chakravarti says that we have to then begin to think planetarily. And this is not to say that I agree with Anthropocene as this great way to think about non-human life. I just think that it's a very useful conceptual tool. And I am aware of the criticism that people like Donna Haraway has raised about Anthropocene, because she says that the Anthropocene does not allow us to think beyond the human, and she says that what we need is a kind of tentacular thinking where we think about world history and planetary history in terms of not just human but human non-human connections. The second question is also very interesting, because I was just thinking about madness and how Foucault defines it, and there really isn't a history of mad dogs and how they figure in spatialities of anything. And I think that's an interesting avenue of further exploration. But just to think about it right now, I think mad dogs, or just dogs that are removed from a particular space because they have rabies. And the ABC rules do state that if a dog is rabid, then he can be removed and he can be euthanized, just not in front of people or other dogs. In front of other dogs, that's what the rules say. And while that certainly suggests a kind of biopolitical control, it also raises the question of how much agency, as you pointed out, does the dog have? But then again, I think the question of biopolitics vis-a-vis agency, it really has to be rethought when we're thinking about non-human forms of life, because I really don't think it can just be a matter of whether I can be intentional and whether I can carry out what I want to do, because that would just be human agency. I hope that addresses some of your concerns.
Okay, Ms. Survi.
Thank you so much for this, again, another very interesting question. I think I'm going to take up your concerns around how to understand land in the context of Orissa, and my colleague Mijo will reflect upon the question on Kerala. So how do I understand land in the context of Orissa is basically the arguments which are like put forwarded by Nikita Sood in her different articles and also very recent book on the making of land. So basically, as she argues, I see land which has a very multi-dimensional presence and which holds multifaceted meanings in the lives of land. And also, as Derek Hall has argued, like land is just not merely a fixed place or a territory, but land also organizes the social lives around it. So the kind of materialities that is associated with the land is basically enlived by the social entities. And I see that the materialities that are attached to land changes and evolves over time and space, and hence it is very mutable and not constant. And as Nikita Sood has argued, like land has a multi-dimensional presence, and sometimes it takes the form of territory, sometimes it is property. It is land is also authority, land is also history, memory, and also contested space of access and exclusion. So these different forms cannot be separated out from each other. Rather, it's the intersections of these forms which makes land and which also defines the kind of social relationships it has organized around it. So in that sense, I see also a key argument which has put forward by Michael Levin, where he sees the different kind of like the global local forces that you have mentioned in your question in the specific case of special economic zones in India. And he argues that it is the pre-existing agrarian inequalities that are reproduced in this process of capitalist accumulation. So we, as we can see that in various contexts and also in the context of Orissa, we can see that land takes different forms. It doesn't have a definitive form of being a territory or being a space of access to a contested space of access and exclusion, but it takes multiple forms. And through this multi-dimensionality, I understand land in this context of ecologically sensitive area.
Right.
So I think Miju would like to add on the Kerala aspects. Yeah.
Yeah, please.
So this
Please
is me.
briefly.
I'll just quickly respond to this. As Surya mentioned, we understand land with this so with social relations. So the underlying argument of the paper is like the land reforms or any other legislation didn't alter the land relations in Kerala as such. So as she mentioned, is reproduces the historically marginalized communities' plight. Like it reproduces the pre-existing inequalities. I know it's highly debatable argument, but I mean the underlying argument of the paper is that the local class relations or class relations didn't alter with any of these land reforms. In fact, is reproduced. Thank you.
Mr. John Mani, you have anything to say?
Yeah, I think a comparative history is very much possible. However, the Mughals in the Brahmaputra Valley never had as long a history as they had in as long or as stable a political history as they had in Bengal. But at the same time, a comparative history between the Ahoms and the Mughals in Bengal is probably possible. And in terms, if I got it right, you were talking about managing water resources, building dams and embankments. So I think Ahoms had a massive infrastructural work going on throughout the medieval period, starting from the 13th to the 17th and 18th century. So that way, probably a comparative history is possible, but references to such works, at least on the part of Mughals in the Brahmaputra Valley, is not really available from the sources. Few sources that I have gone through. Thank you.
So we are running out of time, but I can take one more question. If anyone wishes to say something.
Professor, sorry to interrupt, but we are almost at the end of the panel. So
Yeah, right.
close
So
the
we
Q&A
will
session, if
conclude.
that's okay.
Yeah. So in case if anyone has a question, please feel free to interact with them later. Right. So I just conclude this section. It was a very wonderful section, and with the three very interesting papers, and all three papers raised the environmental context with case studies very nicely. And thank you all. And I conclude this section. We are entering to the new. Professor Soli is already here, so we are entering to the new section, the last very important section. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
so
you,
much.
Professor Santosh, Ibrahim, and all the three panelists for such a wonderful session.